Hello and welcome to week 2 of class. This week we're going to have two videos. The first one we're going to be covering variables and types, and in the second video we'll cover classes and objects and a few basic expressions. Before I get started on tonight's lecture, I did want to touch on a few topics from last week. The first thing that I want to talk about is which folder you should be zipping and submitting with your assignments. As you'll see in the screen right now, I'll have my Visual Studio 2012 projects folder open, and I have three different projects in there. Under Jonathan Mead _ assignment 1, if I go into that, there's another folder inside here, Jonathan Mead assignment 1. Okay, this is not the folder that you want to zip. If you zip up this folder, you're excluding the solution file, which is something that I need for running your program in Visual Studio. So make sure that you're under the projects directory and you zip the entire outside folder and submit that. We had a few people that were zipping up this folder, and that causes a few problems. Nothing that I couldn't work around for assignment 1, but as we get more complicated, we need to make sure we get the right folder zipped up. The next thing that I wanted to touch on that we didn't talk about in week 1 is resubmitting assignments. If for any reason you're unhappy with a grade that you got on an assignment, or you feel that you could have done better, feel free to resubmit that assignment and I will regrade it. I realize there may be misunderstandings in what I'm asking you to do with the assignment, or you may just get lost. If you need to resubmit an assignment, that's fine. All of the Blackboard assignments should allow you unlimited attempts. If for some reason it gives you an error, send me an email and let me know, and I'll make sure that you can submit it again. Also, I wanted to make sure that you included your name when you created an assignment. When you go in Visual Studio, File, New Project, and you create this assignment or this project right here, make sure you include your name when you type that in. I let it slide on week 1 if you didn't do that, but from now on, if your name isn't in that solution, I won't grade the solution. The reason for that is because I download everything at once, and if I don't have your name in it, I may overwrite your project, or I may grade it and not know who to put it under. So make sure that you include your name when you create a new project. And finally, I just wanted to touch a little on something that I said in the syllabus that I don't think I really explained. I do give extra credit if you go above and beyond the assignment. For example, this week's assignment, we're going to be writing a grade calculator, and it's a very simple application, straightforward, that's going to be asking you to enter stuff in. If you go beyond what I required, so say for example you use looping or an array or something like that to create the program, I'll give you extra credit. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to email me throughout the week. And one last thing, I did make a small mistake on the syllabus. I am going to be putting an announcement out about that actually tonight, and putting up a new syllabus, but in week 2 we need to start reading chapter 2. I know I'd said just finish reading chapter 1, but week 2 is actually covering chapter 2 items and not chapter 1 items. So like I said, I'll put an announcement about that and put a corrected syllabus out on Blackboard. And now to the programming. Tonight in this lecture we're going to be talking about types and variables. And a lot of times people will use those two terms interchangeably with many different programming languages. In reality, a type and a variable are two different things. They have a symbiotic relationship, but they are two different things. A variable is a location in your computer's memory where data is stored. So if, for example, you needed to store a number, say the number 5, in a program, you could do that by storing it in a variable. A type is what defines the variable. So in our example where we're storing the number 5 in memory, we'd want to use a number type to assign that variable. And we'll go over exactly what I mean there in just a minute. But variables and types are really the building blocks to creating programs. And let me go ahead and show you how you do that in C#. If you look in your book on page, looks like 75, they start talking about variables. And the way in C# we create a variable is we say what type the variable is, and then we give it a name or an identifier, and then we can assign a value to it. So in C#, if I wanted to declare a number, the number 5, and I wanted to store that in memory, I would start by saying what type it is. And for a simple number, we can use the type of int. Int stands for integer, and it will allow me to store a numeric value, a whole number, in a spot in memory. Next thing we have to do is we have to give this a name or an identifier. So I'm going to say this is my number, and we're done. We've actually created a variable, a spot in memory to store my number. Now in C#, we've done what we call defining the variable, but we have not initialized the variable yet. This is the variable declaration. To initialize the variable, we actually have to assign it a number. So as you can see, my little underscore here says the variable my number is declared, never used. If I set that equal to 0, I have now declared my variable and initialized it because I've put an initial starting value into that variable. So let's go over what some of the different types are in C#. This one here that we just used, that is an integer. That's a whole number, as we said. But let's say we wanted to use a decimal. There's a couple of different types that we can use for decimals. Probably the most common one is going to be a double. So we can do my double equals 1.5. And that's valid. It's a decimal number, and it's stored in a type of double. Another common one is float. So we could do my float equals 1.56. That again is valid. Okay, oops, I forgot to put, when you assign a float, you actually have to put a keyword F after the number to make it work correctly. The major difference between a float and a double, they're both capable of holding decimal point values, is the size. A float variable can only hold up to 7 digits, whereas a double can hold 15 to 16 digits. A double takes up quite a bit more memory than a float does. It's a 30, or I'm sorry, the double is a 64-bit integer, or sorry, a 64-bit variable, where the float is only a 32-bit variable, and that's where the size comes in on those. Another common type of variable that you'll see, or type that you'll see, is a string. A string allows you to store text, basically, in a variable. So I could do string, oops, my string equals, this is my string. And that is a valid variable. Along those same lines, another common type is character, or char. And we can do my char. Character is going to hold a single letter in it. It doesn't hold a string or a list of letters to create a whole string, but it creates a single letter. In fact, a string is a string of characters. That's where it gets the name string from. And the last one that we're going to talk about tonight is a Boolean value. It's the keyword BOOL. And this is going to be a true or false value. So basically it's only 1 bit long, and it either holds a 0 for false or a 1 for true. And those come in very handy, even though they're very small variables. They do quite a bit in programming. Something to keep in mind when you're creating identifiers for your variables is case. C# is a case-sensitive language. That means that this Boolean value of my bool is different from if I were to create the same identifier in all capital letters. C# tracks whether the identifier is in upper and lower case. Typically in C# programming, we use what's called Pascal case when we're declaring public variables. And Pascal case just means that you capitalize the first letter of every word. So, for example, if I were to create a string with an identifier called "this is my string," that is using Pascal case. So the T is capitalized, the I is capitalized, the M is capitalized, and the S is capitalized. You'll also see people using what's called camel case. Camel case is pretty much the exact same thing as Pascal case, but it uses a lowercase first letter. So this is my string. So this is camel case, and this is typically used in C# when we're declaring variables inside of a method or private variables. So it's important to know the difference between Pascal case and camel case. You don't want to use like all lowercase letters when declaring your variables, because those get really hard to read, and as you start working on large programs, figuring out what variable is what becomes extremely important. So far, everything I've done has been what is called explicitly typed variables. What that means is I am defining the type that I'm using for each variable explicitly. I'm telling C# I want this variable here to be an integer value. C# does have the capability of implicitly typing variables. And the way you do that is you just use the keyword var, standing for variable. So if I wanted to create a variable called my var string, I can do that. But if I try just to create that variable, Visual Studio is going to give me an error. It's going to say that I have to initialize this variable if I'm going to use the implicitly type. So for my var string, if I set that equal to a string of characters, what Visual Studio is going to do is it's going to figure out what the best type is to use for this variable and use that type. That way you can actually reuse the variables for cross types. You can declare them and declare it as whatever Visual Studio thinks is the best. So I could do a var my var int equals 5, and that's going to create an integer variable instead of creating a string variable, because it's setting it to an integer of 5. This becomes extremely handy when we start going into much more complicated ideas in C# that have to do with creating lists and arrays and stuff like that. It's easy to create a quick variable in code that you just allow whatever you're chucking into it to define what it's going to be. So let's look at a practical use for variables. We're just going to go ahead and clear this out. Let's say we want to write a program that is going to prompt a user for input at the console and then save that input in a variable in the C# program. So the first thing that I need to do is create a variable. So let's create a string variable and call it user input. Then we need to prompt the user for that user input. So I'm going to say console.writeLine, please input a string. And then we're going to assign whatever value the user types in into the variable user input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say user input equals console.readLine, and readLine will get me the entire text that the user puts in. And then we're going to display that back to the screen. So we're just going to do another console.writeLine, and we're going to write the user input back out to the screen. Now you'll notice up here on this console.writeLine, I'm saying please input a string, and I put that in parentheses. Basically what I'm doing there is I'm creating a string value on the fly as I'm writing the code. I could also have easily done string created a created a string called entry string and sent that to console.writeLine. Both of those are string values. So this is a string value, and we know that because it's defined by the two quotation marks there. And then this is also a string value. It's just using the variable that represents that string value in the code rather than the literal string value. So let's go ahead and run this. So we'll hit the start button on debug, and you'll say please input a string. This is a string. And of course our program just ran too quickly because I forgot to put a stop in there. So we're going to say console.write press any key to exit, and then do a console.read. Okay, now let's go ahead and run that, and it'll say please input a string. This is a string, and you'll see it's just going to write that same text out to the screen and then say the press any key to exit. We put our pause in there, press any key to exit, and the program is done. So this is using the console.writeLine and console.read and assigning a value to that variable user input. So let's say we want to change this and we want the user to input a number. So we're going to change that to an integer. And we're going to say please input an int value. And you'll notice that Visual Studio is already flagging us as having an error. Right down here it's saying that the console.readLine represents a string, and it cannot implicitly convert the type of string to int. So the best way to do this is to do a convert to, we'll just do int 16. It doesn't need to be all that large. And we'll take the console.readLine, convert it to an integer value, and store that in the variable. The keyword convert is going to be, you're going to use it heavily when you start converting strings to numbers. It's a class that's built into .NET to do the conversion for you from a string value to an integer value. Okay, so now let's run this program and see what happens. So we're going to hit start, saying please enter an integer. We'll enter the integer of 5, and it throws a 5 back at us. You will notice that if we run this again and we put a string in there, it's going to throw an error in C# because it can't convert ASDF to an integer value. So eventually we will go through putting error handling into your application so that you can sense if that's happening and do something about it. But for now, we're just going to assume the user input is correct in these first few assignments that we do, and do the conversions just automatically. Before we wrap up this lecture, there's one other topic that I want to touch on, and that's creating constant variables. A constant variable is something that you're going to create in your program that does not change. So if we wanted to create a variable that says please enter a value, and we want that to be constant throughout the program, we want that never to change, we can use the keyword const, C-O-N-S-T, and then declare the variable string. Another note, when you're creating constant values, typically you use a all uppercase notation and then put an underscore in between two words. So enter value would be enter in capital letters, underscore value in capital letters. And we'll just set that to a string. So now if we use this again, if we were to do a console.writeLine, we can do enter value. Notice that when I'm typing, I should point this out, Visual Studio has something called IntelliSense, that as I type, it looks for the best match to what it thinks I want to write, and it gives me some options here. So when you see me just enter in a few letters and then hit, well, I'm hitting the tab key, and that will auto-populate that text in there. So you don't actually have to type everything out. You can start to type out what you want, and as Visual Studio finds that for you, it will auto-populate that if you just hit the tab key or the enter key. Both keys work. So we've done a console, writeLine, enter value, and now just put a pause in here, console.read. If I run this program, you can see it puts my string out to the screen. Constant variables are used for things like connection strings, things that don't change in your database, or I'm sorry, in your program, like a database connection string. That's going to be the same every time you use it, so you can just set it as a constant variable. Not really quite sure why the book went into constant in chapter 2 and didn't save that for later on. It is more of an advanced topic, and you don't really have to worry about using it for right now. Just I wanted to explain what it was, and since the book had already put it in there. So that's it for this lecture. It wasn't too much, I hope. We are going to have a couple more lecture videos this week. We're going to be talking about classes and objects, and also doing math inside Visual Studio and C#. And finally, we'll also be wrapping up with talking about string formatting and using escape characters in your string and making text look pretty. So those will be future videos that will be posted to Blackboard. Again, if you have any questions on any of these concepts, feel free to send me an email, jmead11@ivytech.edu, or post a message in the I Need Help forum of Blackboard. Thank you very much.